some neighborhoods reported that they didn't get any evacuation notice, and it was through other neighbors letting them know, saying, "Hey, we should probably get out of here. We can see the fire."
Imagine waking up to find your neighborhood covered in smoke without ever receiving a warning to evacuate. That was a reality for many people during the recent Los Angeles wildfires. And despite all our advances in geospatial technology, wildfire alerts are still failing when people need them most. But why, and more importantly, how can we fix it? In this episode, I'm joined by Mina Nada, remote sensing specialist, to break down what went wrong, how geospatial data is used in disaster response, and where we need to improve. From satellite imagery to predictive modeling, we discuss the future of wildfire detection and the steps we can take to make sure communities stay safe. If you care about geospatial technology and its role in saving lives, this is an episode you don't want. All right, so today I wanted to introduce Mina, who is joining us here. You'll be seeing a lot more of him as we start to kind of talk and discuss a few different things. If you haven't checked out the newsletter, we've been publishing some shared newsletters, and Mina has a lot of background in history and things that I don't have background in, particularly around Earth observation and the science around that, and areas around climate and lots of different things. But better than me introducing Mina, why don't you just introduce yourself, as you'll do a much better job than I do.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Matt. So yeah, my name is Mina. I would kind of consider myself a biogeographer and remote sensing specialist. I kind of marry those two industries within the broader, I guess, geospatial community. My background is originally in earth science, and then later I got a master's in geography. And so after that, I've been very fortunate enough to kind of break my foot in the door in this industry, working in a variety of GIS roles, whether they were kind of technician or analyst roles, to remote sensing researchers and kind of dealing with satellites and remote sensing and trying to process imagery and creating end use products for users, whether it's through or whether it's community-based organizations or governments. I kind of worked kind of along the stack, and so I've been very fortunate enough to kind of learn as much as I did now, and I'm trying to give back to the kind of next generation of geospatial folks that really want to learn but don't necessarily have the capacity to guide themselves through this very confusing landscape.
Yeah, that's kind of how I started too. I had learned this stuff via many online tutorials and articles, and I definitely don't have the educational depth that you have, so I was kind of figuring this out as I went along. But you reached out to me, and we kind of started to work on some different articles. Like I said, remote sensing, earth observation, I know how to work with raster data. I've used it, I've processed it and things like that, but some of the more advanced science behind it and applying it to specific use cases, that's something that is still new for me. So I'm glad you reached out, and we started to collaborate on those. If you want to check out the newsletter, that's in the comments or show description, the show notes. I don't somewhere down below. If you're wherever you're watching this, you can check out, and there'll be more articles there. Mina's been doing the heavy lifting there, and I've kind of added some context from the data processing, data engineering side as we've gone through it. We published an article about the floods in Valencia, and started with that. But of course, nearly probably like a week after that happened, there were the very severe fires in Los Angeles. I mean, you're in LA, so I wanted to kind of start by discussing that and talk about some of what we saw happening, what you saw happening, and some of those things. But what was your experience actually being there, and experiencing this event?
Yeah, I've been very grateful in that both me and my family are safe. I ended up I work in Thousand Oaks, so it's very near to the Palisades fire, and so there were a few days kind of within the uh, height of the fires. There was definitely billows of smoke and ash just kind of raining and depositing on cars, neighborhoods. So it was quite scary, but as a Southern California local, it's not like I was not used to it, but the scale and the intensity and the quickness of how this fire raged on was something that I haven't really seen before in many years. And I've lived here pretty much almost 2 decades. So it was a very stark reminder. So at least from a personal standpoint, I think from a I guess a geospatial lens, I feel that there were things that they got as an industry right, and some things that I feel that they could definitely improve upon. One thing that I felt that they done really well was being able to task these satellites and create these vegetation maps or these burned area maps of severity on which kind of neighborhoods or how or at right now we have maps highlighting which individual houses and the rate of damage for each individual neighborhood, which is really useful for people that come in doing these assessments, whether it's through the insurances or whether it's just local homeowners trying to figure out, if they haven't gone back home to their neighborhoods, what has, been, how has my home been affected? So I think that's one aspect that they got really right. Another one aspect that I think they could have done a lot better was the communication end of trying to alert and notify the residences of, hey, there's probably a fire very near. You should probably evacuate. Some neighborhoods reported that they didn't get any evacuation notice, and it was through other neighbors letting them know, saying, hey, we should probably get out of here. We can see the fire. And so it was, I think, really frustrating as a geospatial professional and as a Southern California local. And I'm not the only one who said this. I believe Dr. Pagan, uh, who is, I think, based at JPL. She herself was she lives in Palisades, and she wasn't even able to get those emergency evacuation notices in time, I believe, or it was something along the lines of her still not understanding the scale of the response efforts and not being able to understand what exactly where she needed to go in order to find the right resources she needed to keep her and her family safe. So I think that was kind of the general highlights or kind of my key takeaways kind of after a couple of weeks from the fires. They're now kind of almost contained. And now we've been able to kind of take a moment and reflect because there was a lot of pointing fingers during the height of the fire. So that's kind of my take.
Yeah. I mean, it's noticing it from afar, and I've never been through something like that. I mean, I've been in, flood situations in New York where, is some of the Hurricane Sandy, and then a few other like these flash flood things. I mean, my biggest thing is in most cases, things are changing and moving so quickly with climate, and a lot of what I saw coming out of, or from the geospatial space were a lot of maps of like, here's things that have happened, right? I think I saw a few that were really maps that help people at least get a grasp of what's happening, or at least trying to get them to say what's happening within a mile of where I am. Very simple spatial questions that maybe were difficult to answer, or but like you said, getting these notices, getting these things that are really important was difficult. But a lot of it's kind of, hey, here's a view of like, kind of looking at, unfortunately, the devastation, right? And while I believe that, you know understanding the scale of this is important, and talking about that and having a very clear view of the scale is important, um I also think that there's a another call to action, if you will, about doing more to be responsive in the moment, or even getting ahead of it and trying to model or predict or anything like that. Certainly we have the technology and we have the data to do these things. I don't want to, be prescriptive to say like, well, we should have been doing this the whole time, because these things have just been ramping up. Like in my lifetime, I don't remember the frequency of, severe climate events happening like this. Certainly they happen, but this almost it's now becoming too regular to ignore, unfortunately. So I think what I've seen, and what I've heard as at least another outcome of this, is that we within geospatial should be focusing on creating more tools to predict and model and be prepared for these things, I know fires in particular present some different challenges, and maybe we can talk about that because it's certainly we know where there's fire risk given some of the science behind it. The vegetation, if there's a lot of it, if it's dry, where there's winds, where there's other risk like that, and we know once a fire starts, we can start to model where it will go based on slope and wind and all these different factors. But knowing where it starts is very difficult to that's nearly impossible to predict where a fire will start. But can we in some way join those two and start to model, hey, given a set of scenarios where we think it could start, if we know it starts here, here's the things that should happen after that, from response, from evacuations. Maybe that's a place we should start to go. And I think that's kind of the message that I heard coming out of that. So I mean, if you do you want to talk a little bit about the science of these fires specifically? I know there's some specific things to the greater LA region that make it have specific climate effects to that. But if we want to talk about that, maybe talk about like paths forward. Like I think what could we start to do there?
Yeah, so there's a few. It's viewing the problem can be a bit complex, so we can try to break it down. The first is the kind of biogeography of the region. And in Southern California, we experience this phenomenon called the Santa Ana winds, which usually occur or happens when cool air that's coming from the Rockies, so think of kind of like Colorado, are moving westward towards the western coast, towards the west coast. And as this air is moving down from these highlands, down from the mountains, they are not only being compressed since these columns of air are going through valleys, they are also being heated because they are being compressed. So you have what was originally cold, dense, or cold, cool air now becoming hotter and moving a lot more faster. And if you combine that with the very dry vegetation that we have here in Southern California, because of these past 2 to 3 years, we've had very moderate precipitation, pretty decent amount of rainfall. It created a above average amount of biomass vegetation, if you will, above ground, which then dried up because we had a pretty dry, rainy season this year, this winter. And now we have you combine those two, and those are just kind of like a very ripe combination of starting wildfires. So in terms of being able to know where to predict uh, where fires happening, a lot like Southern California, Edison, Cal Fire, they pump a lot of research and effort behind trying to answer those types of questions. And because of that, they have specific measures that they try to put in place in these neighborhoods, saying, hey, maybe you shouldn't plant or have trees a certain feet from your home. Maybe you shouldn't use wood as your roofing because those things tend to uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Tends to exaggerate the exacerbate the wildfire situation. And if you multiply that with how fires spread, generally it's caused by embers from one tree kind of flying because of the high winds to another and then starting another fire in a different location. So if we take kind of all those factors in place, you can see how fast and how quickly and widespread these fires came, and kind of decimated the areas that I went through. But I agree that we do indeed need models to predict where these things may occur and try to produce suitability models. Insurance companies are really, really good at doing that. They're employing more and more satellite data to provide those types of insights. And I think the nuance that what most people I would like more people to understand, and I think even more people in the geospatial industry, is that satellites can only measure the symptom of what we do in the aftermath. They don't necessarily provide insight on the cause of the thing that we're looking into, which in this case is disasters. I think if we, I think it's the more unglamorous sides of geospatial of keeping county parcels accountable for making sure that they are fireproof as best as they can, and implementing those drought resistant management policies, I think lead to situations where when Santa Antas do occur, when dry vegetation is the norm here, it's not as widespread and we can kind of pounce on it rather than trying to put a band-aid on the symptom rather than trying to examine and investigate the root cause. But that's kind of my pet peeve when it comes to
Mhm.
technology and how we, as a society, view it as the solver of all our problems rather than it just being a tool,
Right,
and it can be
right,
used both
and
ways.
yeah, I think it was. I mean, it's interesting because you said like there's the satellite imagery can look at symptoms and aftermath, and even when something's happening, these are like constellations flying in space. Someone's going to have to like repoint them to focus on a specific area, and there's all challenges with that. Um, but I think as you were talking, when you're talking about the tree canopy, the roof cover, like I've seen models that look at roofing and look at roofing material, and that data exists. We know where tree canopy is, and there's
Yeah,
people looking at those types of things. So it's not like this data isn't there, right? And we can even start to look at and monitor, and be it from a public policy perspective, from a kind of enforcement or monitoring perspective, or even from an insurance perspective, to say like here's things you can do to improve your whatever that might be. The data is there and this exists. So I think it now becomes a focus of, okay, well, how can we put more of that into action? And
yeah,
my mind goes to some of the either the modeling or the data, or how do we get that into more people's hands, because that's usually, I think, where there's we talk a lot about the things you can do, and now it's the doing that needs to kind of take place there. So it's interesting to hear that more granular science of like you said, the it's different factors that make it so specific there, and how it became such a devastating fire so quickly. So that's it seems like there's places to go, and ways to take it than just hey, we have disaster, and here's what that disaster looks like after the fact.
yeah. I agree, and there's a lot of work to be done, and there's no shortage of work, I suppose, and there's definitely never a dull day in the world of geospatial.
Right, right. So if someone was trying to take a step, like I want to look at this, I want to dive into this problem, where would you suggest looking? What would you suggest doing?
Specifically for fires, I would invite and encourage people to maybe go on YouTube and search if they're, I'm guessing they're maybe a bit more programming or coding centric, maybe looking into how to work with Google Earth Engine. So that way you can access free and publicly available satellite data from the US, such as Landsat, or from the European Space Agency like Sentinel-1 or Sentinel-2, and have them kind of expose yourself to how to process this type of satellite imagery if you're really curious on creating your own maps and your own data. I would say there's plenty of free resources from the government side. They have many of them have their own GIS geospatial data that they host, and so you'd be able to access that for free, whether it's building data, parcel data, tree canopy cover. There's a lot of repositories out there for GIS and geospatial related data that you can start to play around with.
Yeah. Yeah. I've noticed some other data sets that have been, I've looked into more and more. There's like Landfire data set, which is a pretty large,
Mhm.
it's a very giant raster data set. I think the US
Yeah.
government produces, but gives you like fire ignition types and things like that. Copernicus has like, daily fire indexes that are being updated on a regular basis. Obviously, I think I don't know the data source, but there's fire boundaries of historical fire boundaries that have
Mhm.
existed over time. We know things like elevation. We know we have wind forecasts. This data is all there. It's just kind of like bringing it
Yeah.
into one place. So you can certainly start to explore these things and look at them at a even a local level, just to understand what things are taking place. I think the hard part, like you pointed out, is these are generally large data sets. Especially when you add a temporal aspect, you're looking at years worth of data going back every single day. So starting to understand how to work with the spatiotemporal data is definitely a skill that I think there's definitely one we can take a look at. And it's, there's definitely ways to do that. And then also the volume, like Landfire is I looked at it, I think it's like a 2.5 gigabyte massive raster, like zipped
Yeah,
up,
it's not small.
so no, so there's all these complexities on working with that. So I've been working increasingly, like trying to say, like, I think there's a balance of taking really large data and having some folks that know how to work with that, but then making accessible for people to chunk out and take just the bit that they need, in your more desktop GIS tools. And I think I've seen that starting to happen with GeoParquet and some of the cloud native file types. So I'm curious as to like how that can apply to raster and those types of things going forward. And there's certainly the formats there, but it's when you boil it down, and at least this is my opinion, so I'd love to hear your take on this too, is I think when you get people more access to the data in easier ways to start to understand these things, different things can come out of that. But you have to do the work to get the data in people's hands and make it easy, at the end of the day.
I agree with that sentiment, and I would just also add that my philosophy is if you want people to care, you gotta create that sense of connection with what it is that you're trying to have them care more about. And so within the cases of this, I would maybe look into Maxar open data because they would have um, images of regions before and after a particular
Mhm.
disaster. And
Yep.
so I think that's helpful in the sense that you have a bite-sized chunk of data that you can work with. You can see the before and after, and you can uh, tailor and kind of make sure that your focus is on that thing rather than how can I extract a particular region from a 2 GB raster.
Yeah.
That just kind of the best process is no process, and so if you're able to make it very accessible, whether it's in a Python notebook or whether it's in a Colab notebook online in the cloud, these things can make it a little bit easier to break down the barriers of how to access and manipulate and work with this type of data.
Yeah, I like that. The best process is no process. So finding ways to make that more accessible and easy is definitely the way to go. Well, cool.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, yeah, thanks for taking the time. Like I said, if you haven't signed up for the newsletter, that's where you get information about these things first, and then we'll also spend some time kind of discussing them like we did today. But Mina, thanks again. I appreciate your kind of collaboration and partnership on these things, and helping me and others start to understand this world in a little bit more detail.
I always say this to everyone when I talk about this type of stuff, Matt, the joys and the learning. So
Yep.
I'm just here to have fun.
Awesome. Well, thank you, and yeah, glad to hear you're doing okay, and glad that LA is going to get back on its feet as I knew it would, regardless. So
It will.
good. All right. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.